Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Fireside Chat with Chancellor John King. We have a bunch of seats in the front if you all want to come move forward and get a spot. We'll just get started in a minute when everyone settles down. Amazing. Thanks, everyone, for attending. My name is Siya Raj Purohit. I work on education at OpenAI. And before I introduce Chancellor John King, I'd love to provide a little bit of context around this session and why we think it's so important. So right now, we're at this moment of unprecedented potential. We now have this super intelligence that's not in my brain or your brain. It exists in the space in between. And that, coupled with the internet, is so powerful because we can finally tackle so many of society's most challenging problems. And what we need to do that is a generation of people who want to use these tools to create a more just and equitable society. So my friend Phil Chu and I were talking about how we can inspire more people to serve in the public sector and to kind of take on these roles to fix and strengthen the American education system. And so in today's conversation, we wanted to chat with someone who's had an extraordinary career in public service and just gain insights on what public institutions can do and improve the quality of life for people, help enable more equitable education. And our goal is to learn about public innovation and also hopefully inspire some of you to consider paths in public service. So really excited to be joined with Chancellor John King. He's had an extraordinary career. He was a teacher, then a middle school principal, New York State Commissioner of Education, then US Secretary of Education under President Obama, and now is leading the State University of New York system as Chancellor. So please help me welcome John King. Thank you so much for joining us.
Excited for the conversation.
So I'd love to start with what drew you to public service. There's so many things you could have done with your talent and time. Would love to hear why public service.
Yeah. Well, it's really two things. I mean, one, it starts with my own personal experience with school and why school mattered so much to me. When I was a kid growing up, both my parents were New York City public school educators. I grew up in Brooklyn. And school was a really important place in my life. And then both of my parents passed away when I was a kid. My mom when I was 8 and my dad when I was 12. And in the period when it was just my dad and me, my dad was struggling with Alzheimer's. Home was incredibly difficult. And the thing that saved me was school. School was the one place in my life that was safe, consistent, nurturing, supportive. I had this amazing teacher, Alan Osterweil. He had us do Shakespeare in elementary school. We did a production of Alice in Wonderland. I was the rose with big red felt petals sticking out of my head. And I remember those things so clearly because school was such a safe haven for me. I'm still in touch with Mr. Osterweil. I had lunch with him a few weeks ago. If not for him, I wouldn't be sitting here. And so that's really what drove my decision to become an educator. It was really teachers who saved my life. And after my parents passed, I moved around, different family members, different schools, but it was always teachers who gave me a sense of hope and purpose. And so I decided to become an educator in order to try to do for other kids what teachers had done for me. What drew me to system level work really was the opportunity for scale change. You think about New York State Education Department, we have 2.5 million K-12 students in New York. You think about the U.S. Education Department, there are some 50 million kids in K-12 schools across the country, another 19 million students in higher ed. So the ability to have tremendous scale impact was very appealing. And the ability in the public sector to leverage extraordinary resources. I have a lot of friends who are involved in philanthropy. And philanthropy can be a tremendous lever for change, but will always be dwarfed by the incredible resources, the literally billions of dollars that are available through the public sector to try to advance the public good. And so the chance to try to do more for kids at scale is what drew me ultimately to public service.
So a lot of the audience today is working in the private sector right now. if you were to recommend to them why they should work in public service, is it because of the scale and the resources accessible there?
Yes, and I think there's a unique set of skills that folks from private sector experience can bring to the public sector. Two things I think about in particular. One is there's a certain nimbleness of the private sector that isn't always present in the public sector, to put it politely. The sense that in the private sector you sort of have to adapt or perish, that is not as true in the public sector. You can keep doing a thing that isn't working in the public sector for a very long time before anyone notices. And so there isn't that nimbleness or responsiveness sometimes that you see in the private sector. The other thing that I think I've tried to work on in my career, but that the public sector sometimes struggles with, is using evidence to drive decision making. The sort of A/B testing that is so common in a private sector context, particularly in the tech industry, isn't really present in the education sector very much. There is a growing movement to try to use evidence, to do randomized controlled trials, to test interventions, but there isn't necessarily that history. Another element that I think private sector folks can bring, and I saw this firsthand when I was secretary, is an approach that I would describe as maybe more user-centered in the design of tech solutions. So one of the things that President Obama did after the healthcare.gov debacle was to bring folks from the tech sector to Washington to work in federal agencies, an initiative that eventually became the U.S. Digital Service. And at the U.S. Education Department, we had Lisa Galopter, who had been the head of digital for BET. She came and joined us to work on the college scorecard. And it was fascinating watching her lead our work on this college scorecard, because she started with talking to students and high school counselors, rather than starting from what does the department think the answer is. She started with the folks who would be using the scorecard. And sometimes our procurement people were nervous. It didn't look exactly like how we usually did tech projects. But the result was the college scorecard, I would say, is an incredibly adaptable, responsive tool. And it was designed that way because Lisa brought some of the experience from the private sector to government.
That's a really good example of where private sector ideology can help the public sector. I guess a lot of people worry about the bureaucracy that comes in public sector roles, though. How would you recommend people navigate that more effectively?
Well, I know the private sector has no bureaucracy, so look, bureaucracy, I think, is present in public and private institutions. There are two things. One is you hope that evidence and efficacy can win the day. And alongside that, almost everything in life comes down to relationship building. And my experience in the public sector is the folks who are most effective are the people who systematically build relationships with the people who are above them, the people who report to them, the people who they have to negotiate with. Sometimes it can be hard, especially if the people you're building relationships with have very different political views. But relationships are the way that you can get things done.
It's amazing. So let's talk a little bit about equity in education. In the 2010s, I used to work at the online education companies that were trying to bring knowledge to the world for free. In the 2020s, now we're trying to bring super intelligence to the world more equitably as well. But I guess I'd love to understand from you, what do you think it will take to get to equity in education?
Softball question early in the morning. Look, maybe I'll describe two obstacles and then some opportunities. So two big obstacles. One is we don't sufficiently disaggregate the data to even tell the truth about where the equity gaps are. After the Obama administration ended, I ran a civil rights organization called the Education Trust. And one of our core areas of focus was getting folks to just tell the truth about the data. That means we've got to look at not just aggregate data, but What's the graduation rate for African American students, for Latino students, for English learners, for students with disabilities? What's the graduation rate in this district for black male students with disabilities? Because only by telling the truth about the data, telling the truth about the rate of chronic absenteeism that we see across school districts today, if we aren't having an honest conversation, we're never going to make progress. So that's one major obstacle. A second major obstacle is the rooms of decision makers look very different from who's being served. And that is true in the private sector, it's true in the public sector. And if you don't have all those perspectives in the room, you will miss things. And we have not been intentional enough as a country about making sure that folks of color have paths to leadership, that folks from low-income backgrounds have paths to leadership. There are a lot of rooms that maybe are racially diverse, but there still isn't actual diversity in socioeconomic background. And so folks can't speak to a different experience growing up. We often have rooms where there are no folks with disabilities. And yet, that's a huge population of students that we're trying to serve. And so intentionality about diversity has to be a part of tackling the equity challenge. I would say on the question of superintelligence and AI and how do we deliver equity in AI, I think the deck is stacked against us, given how resources are distributed in American society today. That said, I think there are some creative opportunities. One thing we're doing in New York, thanks to Governor Hochul, is we're launching something called Empire AI, where we are building a supercomputing site at University at Buffalo that will be accessible to researchers at our 4 research institutions at SUNY, UB, Stony Brook, Binghamton, University at Albany, as well as researchers from CUNY, from Columbia, NYU, Cornell, and RPI. It's ultimately going to be a $400 million investment. And the idea is we will be focused on using AI for the public good. And so we will, yes, exactly, yes. So, for example, we have a project at UB that's been funded by the National Science Foundation that's focused on what are AI tools that you could develop to help students with disabilities make progress in the classroom. We have a number of researchers who are working on projects around AI in healthcare, researchers who are working on projects related to AI and climate resilience, being able to predict the impact of extreme weather events, which feels terribly relevant this week. And one of the reasons we wanted to do the project this way is because we don't think AI should only belong to Google and Meta. And we don't think that at the outset, every AI project should have as its goal a profit margin. There should be ways that researchers can build tools that are, from the beginning, designed to advance the public good. And that's our hope. Now, we won't have the computing power of Google and Meta, but we will have what we hope will be the largest university-based supercomputing capacity in the country.
One thing I've learned in my experience in the tech industry is that all of these tools exist, but there's not enough infrastructure to help everyone be able to utilize them well. So, for example, when Udacity and Coursera were coming up in the early 2010s, we're like, okay, amazing, we'll bring knowledge from the best professors and best minds to everyone for free and make that more accessible. And then we realized that the biggest competitor for these companies was actually Netflix. Because after like a long day of working, and especially for hourly workers, they didn't want to tune in and learn from like a professor. They wanted to watch video and unwind. So like we were fighting against time for these people. And I think that those constraints still exist. So I'd love to understand your perspective on how you think the private sector, which builds these tools very quickly and efficiently, can work with the public sector to make them accessible so people can pursue like paths to better socioeconomic mobility.
Well, a couple things. One is I think we have to be intentional about design that is responsive to what folks need in their lives right now. And that's something we're thinking about for SUNY, across our 64 institutions. How do we make sure we are responsive to people's precise needs? So we've developed 600 micro-credentials because people are looking for ways to do a short-term, career-focused area of training that will allow them to advance at work. they're not necessarily ready to jump into a full 4-year degree program, but if they can get a micro-credential, that's an opportunity for them to get started, move up at work, and hopefully then see the benefit of educational opportunities, and we hope ultimately enroll in degree programs. But we're trying to be responsive to that need that folks have. We've learned that the idea, education will help you get ahead, is too vague. We need to be very specific about, if you come to this program, these are the skills you will get, and this is the job that sits on the other end of that. For example, we have Micron, the semiconductor company, coming to the Syracuse region. That will bring 50,000 jobs to the Syracuse region. It's an incredible renaissance of manufacturing in New York State. When Micron comes, they will need a lot of technicians at the fab that they're building. So we've built a 1-year certificate program at Onondaga Community College specifically designed to prepare folks for those jobs. We have to be that intentional, I think. And so, yes, we want people to seek education because of its intrinsic virtue, but we also have to make it very practical for how will this help me in my life do the things I need to do.
That's very thoughtful intervention, basically, recognizing when we can provide that opportunity. Shifting gears a bit, I would love to understand a little bit about your leadership style. So you have led through a couple of different difficult times, like with the Common Core, systemic issues in the New York State. Would love to hear about what you learned about leading through that.
Well, 3 things. One is, I think any leader, if you're doing good things, you are going to experience pushback of some kind, right? And if you're not experiencing any pushback, then you're probably not moving forward. So there's always going to be some level of pushback. And you should build that in, price that in to what it is to be a leader. Second, you have to be very clear, I think, on what your principles are and what your lines are that you won't cross. I think about this a lot today in K-12 and higher ed around these efforts to ban books, to teach an inaccurate version of history. And I wonder about some of my colleagues in higher education and in K-12. Did they write themselves a little note and say, here are the things I will not do, and put it in their desk? And if they did, are they going back to that note when they're told by their state that you should teach that slavery was an internship program, right? And we have a governor, that's his position, that the people who are enslaved could leverage the experience for skill acquisition. That's absurd. And so if you're told that, you still show up at work the next day and implement that, or do you do something different? And I wonder about that. If you're told that anyone who works on diversity, equity, inclusion on your staff needs to be fired the next day, is that okay with you? Is it not okay? Like, what's your line? And so I think that's an essential leadership question. And look, there are folks who would make the argument, well, if I wasn't in this job, someone worse would be in it. I'm going to repackage diversity, equity, inclusion as belonging and try to keep it going. That's a choice. That's a strategy. So I'm not saying that's necessarily an unethical strategy. It's just, I think as a leader, you need to be clear on what your lines are, what your boundaries are. But ironically, the other thing I would say about leadership through challenging times and through controversy is you also have to have the discipline to listen to the critics for the pearls of wisdom in what they are saying. And that is very hard, because once you've decided that you're taking the principled position, it is very easy to close your ears to what the critics are saying, and you actually could miss very useful feedback and insights that would come from what they are saying. And so having the discipline to both be clear on your values and open-minded that you want to learn and continue to evolve, that is a difficult discipline, but I think that's part of the definition of leadership.
A lot of young college students and 22-year-olds ask me about how they should kind of develop their point of view on like what their values are. Because they're like, there's some values that resonate in one party, some in the other. Like they're just trying to figure out who they really are themselves in terms of their values. What recommendations would you have for them?
Well, a couple things. One is to be in conversation with people who have views that are like yours and folks who you think have views different from yours. And genuine conversation, not the kind of conversation where you're waiting for the other person to finish so you can tell them why they're wrong, but the kind of conversation where you're really listening and trying to understand why the person believes what they do. And those kinds of conversations, I hope that's what we try to create on our campuses, is opportunities for those kinds of conversations in the classroom and in the dorm and at extracurricular activities and, while you're waiting for your turn at the track meet. All those times, I want you to be in conversation with peers that are going to help you evolve your own thinking and clarify your own values. Second, I would say, I'll share a story from something that President Obama said that really stuck with me. We were with a group of students who were involved in a White House mentoring program through an initiative of President Obama's called My Brother's Keeper, which was an effort to focus on improving outcomes for boys and young men of color. So it was a small group of us who were involved in that program, from the cabinet, the president, and a group of young people, just having lunch in the White House. Amazing. One of the students asked the president about his keys to success, what had made him successful in his life. And he said two things, both of which are relevant to this question. One was, he learned in college he was never going to let anyone outwork him, that he might not be the smartest person in the room. Of course, he's always the smartest person in the room. But he said he might not be the smartest person in the room, but he was never going to lose out to someone because they worked harder than he did. I thought that was a powerful lesson, and I think working hard is a skill that we need all our young people to internalize. But second, and this is most relevant to this question of clarifying your values, he said one of the things that had been most helpful to him was reading. Because when you read, you get to inhabit the perspective of people who are different from you. And he talked about his experience growing up, the diversity in his own family, the diversity in the places he lived, and how that had helped him have empathy and see the world from others' perspectives. But he said through reading, you inhabit the worldview of the person who's written their memoir, or the worldview of the central character in a novel, and you can see things that you might not otherwise see. And so I would say to young people who are trying to figure out what they believe, what they care about, do some reading, right? Try to read with this mindset of, I want to see the world from different perspectives.
On the topic of reading, are there any books that have really inspired you?
One of my favorites that I try to reread every year is a book called Leadership Without Easy Answers. It's by a guy named Ron Heifetz, who used to teach at the Harvard Kennedy School. He may still. And it's really about the psychology of leadership in a way. It uses lots of historical examples. But the core argument of the book is that many times people see leadership challenges as technical challenges when they're actually adaptive challenges. And what he means by that is a technical challenge would be like, you have some sort of virus, you go to the doctor, they give you an antibiotic, you take it and it goes away. Right? That's a technical solution. All the doctor did was write you this prescription and it's solved. And a lot of times leaders think that's the way they're going to solve a problem. Figure out the technical answer and it will be solved. And communities often expect that of the leader. Please tell us the answer. It will be solved. But his argument is that leadership is actually much more about adaptive challenges, where the community actually has to change its own behavior. He describes it as the community needs to bridge the gap between its values and its reality. And that requires facilitation of an adaptive challenge. It's like if somebody has, if somebody has goes into the doctor and they've got a heart condition that has multiple factors, it's not going to be solved by just a prescription, and there's going to need to be behavior change, exercise, eating differently, meditation, a whole bunch of things that require change. Well, that also happens in communities, and then the leader's role is to help the community make those changes themselves. That is a much harder thing to achieve as a leader, and he uses some examples, particularly from the civil rights movement, to tell the story of how you achieve adaptive leadership. And I found it to be a very powerful book.
Right now, university leaders across America are having to adapt to this kind of new reality where in a lot of college campuses, there isn't that kind of conversation happening between different sides on issues. Like college was obviously meant to be a place where you can safely debate and argue these kind of ideas and come to your own conclusions together. So I guess, what advice would you have for education leaders who are having to adapt in this environment?
Well, I'll tell you some of the things we're trying to do at SUNY. So we launched an initiative last year, our Civic Education and Engagement Fellowship, where we have 10 faculty members we've identified as essentially civil discourse fellows, whose role is to foster professional development for their faculty colleagues around how do we create environments where we can have healthy civil discourse, where you can disagree agreeably, where you can approach conflict with a learning orientation. And those are habits that are developed in the classroom. And not just in the political science classroom. Those are habits that can be developed in the STEM classrooms as well, right? But this idea of how do you listen to your classmates, right, attentively? How do you raise in the classroom difficult issues with varying perspectives? And there's a set of instructional practices that you can reinforce. One great example from my own daughter's experience at Montgomery Blair High School in Montgomery County, Maryland. They had a project in their high school where you wrote on an issue that was a controversial issue. You wrote an essay arguing one side of the issue as a freshman, and then a year later you wrote the same essay arguing the other side as a sophomore. And it was a very smart exercise because it really made you think through the best evidence on each side of the debate. But one of my daughters observed that she was different as a sophomore writing the essay, that she'd learned things, she'd grown in ways, and so she was bringing something different to the essay. And that was exactly the right takeaway from my view. So we're trying to build those habits. We are also making civic discourse one of our core competencies that needs to be taught across disciplines to every undergraduate before they complete their time at SUNY. We also launched something we call the Empire State Service Corps, an opportunity for 500 SUNY students this year, and we hope to grow it over time, to do public service work in the community, tutoring, environmental work, addressing food and housing insecurity. Because I genuinely believe that through service, you can develop empathy. You also are serving alongside people who are different from you. That also cultivates empathy. So those are the kinds of things I hope higher ed institutions do in response to this moment, right? There's lots that we need to do to make sure we have the right rules on campus and we send the right message about free speech, but also protecting students from harassment and discrimination. We need to do all of that. But in addition, we should see this as a moment reminding us of our core mission around preparing citizens, and we should do things that are going to develop the habits of healthy civic participation.
Building off of that, I'd love your perspective on like what measures of success should look like in higher ed. So, like obviously, traditionally, higher ed has been measured by like test scores as well as graduation rates. Do you think that's still the right measure? And just to give you some context from the private sector, how our thinking has evolved and like some of like the education products we've built, is that initially when like the MOOCs came out, everyone was just like, oh, the drop-off rate is so high. There's a 3% graduation rate. This is definitely not a success. But then we realized that it was more like a library book that we were providing to the world. And a library book is not measured if you read it from cover to cover. It's measured by the intelligence that you gain out of that. And that's how people were using these online courses too. So that was like a big pivot in the edtech sector. Would love to hear how you think about that pivot in higher ed. Like, what does the measure of success look like?
Yeah, look, when people start their higher education journey, they expect to finish, right? They start with the intention to earn, whether it's a credential or a certificate or a degree. So I do think completion is a valuable indicator. But also when people start higher education, they want it to make an economic difference for themselves and their families. And actually, when we do research in New York, we see this is true across race and class. People expect higher education to have a positive impact on their earning potential. And so we think it's important to look at are folks employed? Are folks seeing a positive earnings gain as a result of their higher ed experience? Whether it's a credential, a certificate, or associate's or bachelor's degree or a master's degree. And I'm very optimistic about the use of those sort of long-term measures. Now, we also care about civic participation, so we also are working to make sure that students are registered to vote, and we are making sure that we encourage students to vote, and that we are preparing students who will be engaged in their communities. But earnings impact really matters. Raj Chetty is doing really interesting work at a think tank called Opportunity Insights, where they are looking at the social mobility impact of higher ed institutions. And we're really proud that Stony Brook University, for example, serves one of the highest percentages of Pell-eligible students of any major public research institution, and is one of the nation's leading institutions at moving students from the bottom 2 income quintiles into the top 2 income quintiles. We're excited about that because that's part of our SUNY value proposition. We're going to help folks seize economic opportunity in their own lives. So that to me is an important part of how we should think about higher ed's impact.
And AI is getting into classrooms now, obviously in higher ed. What do you think is going to change in higher ed in the next 5 years? And what do you think is going to stay the same?
Well, look, I think changing classroom practice is really hard. It's true in K-12, it's true in higher ed. You know, at any higher ed institution in America, there is a faculty member teaching today from the notes that they wrote 30 years ago. I remember I had a professor in grad school. The paper was yellowed, you know, like it was had come from the archives that he was teaching from. That's how old the notes were. So it is difficult to make that transition, but I think there are examples of folks who are thinking creatively about that. There's actually an effort, I think it's the Harvard Center for Teaching and Learning, where they are working with faculty on projects to integrate AI into the classroom. Some really interesting examples. One I saw recently was for a French class, creating essentially a virtual world for students to interact with the characters in French, as well as a sort of a conversation with an AI character who was having this conversation with you in French and could give you feedback on your French grammar and pronunciation, but also could evolve the conversation based on what you were saying. So based on sort of how much content knowledge you were demonstrating, they could take the conversation in different directions. That's a really impressive, substantive tool that is actually making a difference for students. I fear that there are lots of products being marketed where it's not really AI. It's just algorithmic production of math worksheets that look just like the math worksheets we used to do on paper at our desk. I'm not as impressed by those tools because I don't think they are necessarily marshaling the power of the tool. But that kind of immersive French class experience, that struck me as something really powerful. They also have a project through this Harvard Center for Teaching and Learning where they're helping students kind of write with ChatGPT rather than just giving them an assignment and they use ChatGPT and everyone acts like it's their own work. This is designed to help them integrate ChatGPT into the writing process in partnership with the professor. I think that's interesting. I think there are probably lots of students, K-12 and higher ed, who used ChatGPT to do their homework last night without learning anything. And that's scary. I think that's a real threat to human learning, right? If students can just ChatGPT their way through school without ever learning content, that's not good. But if we can help them see it as a tool to inform their learning and their work, that would be much better. And so I was encouraged that there was a strategy to try to achieve that. So those are the kinds of things. Look, I'll say in this room, and folks in this room who know me, I'm sort of an ed tech skeptic. Mostly because we're 30, 40 years in, and if the goal was to close equity gaps, we haven't. If the goal was to radically increase student learning in K-12, we haven't. If the goal was to radically improve students' readiness for college, we haven't. So I'm a skeptic in the sense that so far, whether it is the design of the tools or the market behavior that shapes which tools get popularized, we have not yet turned ed tech into the solution to our biggest challenges in the sector. So I'm a skeptic about where we are, but I'm an optimist about where we could be. And so, my thing I would implore everyone in this room to do is to hold themselves to the question, are we building tools that solve those big challenges? Which is different from, are we building tools that are profitable? Are we building tools that solve those big challenges?
I think we're going through a really interesting paradigm shift right now in education too. There was a professor I was talking to at Wharton who said that what is the value of an essay? Like his class output always used to be an essay. And he's like, the output of an essay, it doesn't actually matter what that piece is. What matters is the critical thinking and conversational skills a student has to be able to structure their thoughts in the essay format. So he actually changed his class entirely. What they do now is everyone uses ChatGPT EDU, and instead he measures how many prompts it takes for the student to get to an output that they're satisfied with. Some students are so good at prompt engineering that it takes like 2 prompts and they have a great essay. And some students have to go back and forth like 19, 20 times to get to an essay that they're proud of. And he uses that as a measure of a student's ability to communicate what they're looking for. And being able to communicate effectively, he says, is more important than having an essay output. So I'm in so many of these conversations where we think that the curriculum's going to change just because the knowledge base is accessible to everyone has been elevated.
Look, I think you're raising a really important question. I would also say, how is the student going to assess whether the product is good or not? And that means that they need to have been exposed to really fantastic content, right? And to great writing, right? And so one of my fears is if we don't manage this moment well, students won't know what great looks like. And that would be tragic for the human experience, right? If tech is going to help us improve the human condition, it should make excellence more widely available. And it should create more ways for people to produce excellence, not the other way around. And that choice is really up to us and how we respond in this moment.
Amazing. We have a couple of minutes left, and I would love to hear your advice for whoever's going to become Secretary of Education in 2025.
Sure. So three things. One is, if you ask me what is the highest leverage use of a next dollar in education, I would say the evidence is overwhelming that it is in early childhood. And there is a lot of work we need to do to expand high quality early childhood education. It is good for the workforce, it's good for the economy, but it is ultimately good for students' long-term outcomes. We know that students who participate in high-quality early learning experiences are more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to go into college, more likely to earn a sustainable wage. So early learning should be a core focus. I don't know if it will be, but it should be. Second, I would say we are still struggling in K-12 with the impact of COVID and the reduced learning, math, reading, skills about how to learn, social skills. We are still seeing that in K-12, and this issue of chronic absenteeism and a culture in which the expectation of being in school is not what it was 10 years ago. That is scary. And there isn't, to my mind, enough urgency about those K-12 gaps. And so I would hope that the next secretary brings the fire, brings a tremendous sense of urgency about closing those gaps in K-12 that have widened as a result of COVID. Are happening, but they are not being scaled. And I would love for the next secretary to think about how you scale some interventions that are proven. One thing we're doing at SUNY, there's an intervention called ASAP, which is a wraparound support services approach to help students complete community college. It has been proven in randomized controlled trials to double the completion rates for community college students. Intensive advising, financial support around things like books and transportation, emergency grants. So if something goes wrong in your life, the car breaks down, that's going to cause you to lose your job and be unable to go to school. They can provide that $250 you need to fix the car. A cohort experience where you're with a set of peers going through the program together. That intervention needs to be scaled. We're scaling it to 25 of our interventions that make a difference for long-term outcomes for students, but we are not scaling them quickly. And the education department could be a huge vector for that kind of scaling in the higher ed sector. So those are a few things. I have a long list. I hope they call me because I have a long list for them. But those are a couple of things.
Thanks so much. And last question for you. If there was someone young in their 20s who wanted to someday serve in public service roles in education, what skills and experiences would you recommend they go gain to have the most impact in the public service role eventually?
Two things. One is do the work at the ground level. I just think there's no substitute for spending time in a classroom with kids, talking to families, and you can't focus group that. That's still different from that being your everyday job. So, do Teach for America, do an AmeriCorps program, like City Year, do something that puts you in the community with kids and families, understanding what their experience is like. Even if you want to be an EdTech designer, I'd still say go spend time with kids and educators on the ground level because you will learn so much that you just wouldn't be able to see in a policy class or in a business school class. The second thing I would say is, and to me this is key, whatever career you're interested in, is find mentors who you admire and who are willing to share their experience with you. You know, if you want to be a great teacher, go sit in the classrooms of great teachers. If you want to be an incredible leader in the public sector, find incredible leaders who are willing to talk with you and tell you a little bit about their experience and how they think about the world. There's just no way around the power of mentoring. It's just such an incredible gift.
Amazing. On behalf of everyone here, thank you so much for joining, and thank you for your career in education and pushing the sector forward.